I'm just gonna start by lobbing something right out before lunch here. I'm gonna go quick. It's probably the only time you're gonna hear a farm to table chef say this, but farm to table, in what I and most people in this room would probably consider to be one of the more exciting social movements in America today. It is a movement that has redefined how we think about our urban food shed. Does not really work. Despite the best efforts of chefs and eaters and farmers, farm to table is not shifting and has not shifted in any fundamental way the political and economic forces that shape our food system. Exhibit A, the results of the latest census, which said in the last 5 years, we have lost nearly 100,000 farms. It also said that big food is getting bigger. The top 1% of farms now account for almost half of the value of all farm sales. In order to feed our urban populations sustainably and deliciously, we're going to have to change not only how we source ingredients, but also how we think about food. I'd like to, let's see, oh, if we could go back one, sorry, I jumped that. I'd like to prove, yeah, here we go. I'd like to prove that idea with an example from my own restaurant, a kind of allegorical meal in 3 courses. Here is the first course, whole wheat bread. It's made from a local emmer wheat from New York, which is iconoclastic, first because we serve it as a course in my restaurant, but mainly because it is made from 100% local wheat. For most people, this is a bit of an oxymoron. We think of wheat in monoculture terms, in these terms, 1,000-acre fields in Kansas and North Dakota. But for a chef like me, it's totally ironic, if only because we are so religious about sourcing and cooking with the best ingredients. We are loyal to the farmers markets and rooftop gardens, and we serve only the best vegetables and the freshest vegetables and the most free of free-range meats, and on and on. But when it comes to wheat, we cook and bake with essentially rotten produce. We eat dead wheat, and I'm not just talking about this, although I am, white flour stripped of its germ in the industrial milling process. I'm really talking about this, modern varieties that have been bred for yield, not flavor, and not nutrition. Using this kind of wheat, and we have very little choice because it is where all of our wheat comes from, would be like my building a menu for you this evening at my restaurant with this stuff. Which gets me back to our first course. Brought to you, not so much by me, but by this man, Klaus Martens. Klaus farms 2,000 acres in the Finger Lakes. 200 years ago, before we settled the Great Plains, this was our wheat belt. So Klaus's soils are nicely suited to growing wheat, but he does not just farm wheat. In fact, he grows a variety of crops, and he grows them in these complementary rotations, the same way farmers have done for hundreds of years. The goal is to support the long-term health of the soil. He is not just growing modern, high-yielding varieties of wheat. He's growing emmer and Frederick wheat, Bavarian spelt, heirloom grains, for the most part, that are better suited to his organic system, and I would argue far more delicious. We grind them into whole wheat flour in our restaurant, and the end result is this incredibly nutty and aromatic and beautiful tasting bread. Okay, so that's the first course at my restaurant, and it's the farm to table story. It's a nice one. I'm supporting a local farmer. I'm resurrecting lost flavors, lost varieties, even a lost way of agriculture. So what is wrong with that? Well, it wasn't until I had this offhand conversation with Klaus on a visit to his farm a few years ago that I realized I'd missed the whole point. I went to visit him to learn about what made his wheat so delicious. But instead of talking to me about wheat, Klaus only wanted to talk about his rotations. The key to the flavor of emmer wheat, he said, was in preparing the soil in the right way. In other words, the secret to the emmer is that it's not about the emmer. I had always thought of farming rotations in this as a kind of abstract dictate, but really it's a recipe. You know, for all of our thinking about agriculture and farming today and for the future, we don't really have a language to describe the nuts and bolts of good farming. And for good reason. It's about 1,000 times more complicated than anything I can do in my kitchen. But it's a recipe for the soil that dictates the sustainability of a farming system. And I would argue that it is the way out of a troubled farming future. So if you will bear with me for about 2 minutes, I'd like to try and distill Klaus's thinking into something relatively simple, with the hope that it will kickstart a deeper conversation about the relationship between farm to table and maybe jumpstart hunger for lunch. So let's take that emmer wheat bread that I serve as a course in my restaurant. For Klaus, he would start, I don't know where you start and end a rotation. We're sort of jumping into his farming rotations, but let's say we're starting with spelt, which he plants in the spring. Spelt is a perfect soil builder. It has very deep root systems. The stalk of spelt, the straw, Klaus will plow back into the soil, and it gives him this very hearty boost of carbon. Clover is interspersed with spelt. That means it's double planted at the same time. It provides a nice cover for the winter. It fixes nitrogen into the soil and replenishes the soil. After that, he may plant this high-value crop like corn, not for eating. It's for organic animal feed. And after that, he'll go with a mustard, generally, to restore the depletion of nutrients that corn is responsible for. Next, there's this sort of interesting choice between soybeans and kidney beans. Both are leguminous, which means they both fix nitrogen. But he'll choose one or the other depending on market prices. Or there's always millet, if there's no rain, because millet doesn't require a lot of moisture, and it's a nice way to round out his grain feed mix. After that, he'll go to rye, a cover crop that builds nice soil structure, suppresses weeds, and is yet another great source of carbon. Next, he is prepped and ready for that emmer crop. But I learned that it's really a choose-your-own adventure, because after the spelt-clover combo, he could also go to a brassica, like cabbage or broccoli. That helps suppress weeds and diseases. And next from there, another choice, triticale or barley. Barley is often very interesting. He likes to time it so it comes up in June and suppresses a dreaded thistle, Canadian thistle, an overwhelming weed problem that haunts him for the rest of the summer. So planting barley at the right time prevents that. Or he might intercede with another nitrogen-fixing crop like cowpeas. Either way, he is locked and loaded for that emmer. So what is the lesson here? I was treating Klaus's farm like a grocery store, cherry-picking the ingredient I most wanted for my menu. Yes, it created a market for his local emmer wheat, so I called myself a farm-to-table chef. But I was doing nothing to support the entirety of the system. He may well have been growing a monoculture, because I was still looking at his farm single-mindedly. In order to truly support him and other farmers like him, I realized I needed to support the whole system. Everything that you are looking at on this screen, except for the emmer, goes to livestock. It's a bag feed. Everything. That means it gets fed to chickens and pigs and cattle and dairy cows. And that means Klaus essentially makes no money on this entire board. Pennies on the dollar compared to what he'd make selling crops directly to us. So there is a market for everything that you're looking at, but it's a very inefficient one. economically and ecologically because the value, and nutritionally, because the value of these grains and actually the entirety of the system is only realized when we eat meat and when we drink milk. So the question is, why aren't we maximizing their caloric and nutrient benefits by feeding these grains and leguminous crops directly to people, and in the process maximizing a farmer's economy? That's what we've tried to do at my restaurant, change the way we cook and adapt Blue Hill's menu to reflect Klaus's farming strategy. So we created a dish called rotation risotto. The risotto is not rice. We don't grow rice in the Hudson Valley. But it is all the rotation crops that I just mentioned and many more that are soil-supporting crops that give us that emmer wheat in the end that's so delicious. So that's your second course. Several years later, I visited Klaus again, and this time the lesson was entirely different. I have visited Klaus over many years. He's the hero of a book that I wrote called The Third Plate, and I got to know him quite well, and this was a trip about a year after I had last been there, and the farm was very different, mostly because he had added animals to the system. Pigs had become part of his rotations. They were feeding on the discarded emmer hulls, essentially the peelings of the emmer, which makes them like dumpster diving pigs, free pigs. And he puts them out into the emmer field post-harvest to forage for the straw. And then their manure becomes a nitrogen source for the soil, and they become like sanitation men and women for the farm. He has done the same now with chickens. And meanwhile, he continues to evolve the rest of the system. Wapsie Valley, a heritage corn, has replaced some of his high-value feed corn. So now he is feeding corn directly to people. Barley is another one of his rotational crops. But again, usually, almost always, it goes into a general feed mix. We started thinking, why not make it into a beer? So Klaus started using a new variety that would ensure the best beer. The problem is that even the best microbreweries have to go to Europe to get their grains because local maltsters have all but disappeared in this country. But working with Klaus, we partnered with a small-scale maltster. In fact, a maltster opened in the Hudson Valley because of the demand of all these microbreweries. And in 2010, Klaus started selling his barley to the maltster. He now, 4 years later, delivers 40% of his barley. His farm is 2,200 acres. He grows 40% of his barley is now sold to this maltster at a 500% profit. So we created a dish that honored the maturation of these rotations. Pigs that are fed on Klaus's grain, polenta that is made from his Wapsie Valley corn, and a sauce made from Klaus's malted barley. Okay, so there it is, our three-course meal. I wanted to leave you here before we go to lunch with a few things to think about, three in particular. One is the farm-to-table movement, at least the way we're thinking about it now, is the wrong way to think about it, especially if we're looking to feed growing urban populations around the world, because it sets us up as end users. It's a passive system, when really we need to do a little more work here and start to engage with people like Klaus. Number two, it's the urban sector that really needs to do the engaging, because Klaus is too large to pick up his harvest, pack it in a truck, and sell it at a farmer's market. And increasingly, as we know, he is way too small to fit into the Walmartification of the food system. We tend to focus on the romantic idea of small family farms. And as people who love good food, we fetishize the small and the artisanal. But we haven't done enough to draw attention to these farms of the middle. They still represent, in the United States, 40% of the produce being harvested from our agriculture, and they are in a unique position to transition from commodity agriculture, that is corn and soybeans essentially, to more diversified crop rotations like the ones we looked at a moment ago. And number 3, the other way we can help is at the table. And I think this might be the most profound way. Because as I learned with Klaus, this system does not work unless it's tethered to a cuisine, a real pattern of eating that responds to and thoroughly supports ecology's demands. By encouraging this kind of diversity on our plates, grains, beans, brassicas, and animals too, we can encourage and ensure diversity in our fields, which, when you think about it, is the most exciting opportunity we have to redefine our diets and our landscapes from the ground up. Thank you.